Now, by the time that my guy, Bahadur Shah Zafar, the last Mughal of the title of this book, comes to the throne, let's see whether we can get the first slide on. By the time that this picture is painted in 1832, 200 years have passed since the time of Akbar, and the Mughal dominions have contracted dramatically from the wide empires of Akbar to only the walls of Delhi. But the same Mughal traditions of tolerance, of religious pluralism, and multi-ethnic and multi-religious court life continues. And where Zafar is extraordinary is that this man who ascends the Mughal throne at the age of, in his mid-60s, in the 1830s, with an empty treasury. The Mughal army has long vanished. The riches and piles of diamonds which attracted the merchants to the court of Akbar have long been dispersed and robbed. Zafar's extraordinary achievement is almost uniquely in history to act as catalyst for one of the great renaissances of Indian history in a time of extreme economic decline. In almost all places in the world where you have exciting moments when the whole pace and pulse of artistic life transforming itself into some form of renaissance, these almost always take place during times of economic growth, for very simple reasons, that you need to have money to patronize great buildings and most artistic renaissance. What's unique about Zafar is that Zafar, who is a mystic poet, who is a calligrapher, who is a poet, and an amazing writer on philosophy and higher Sufi mysticism, Zafar, by example, rather than by power of patronage, produces in Delhi one of the great moments of Indian literature. Zafar's court is the court of the poets Ghalib and Zawq, which is to Urdu poetry and to modern Indian poetry what the names like Marlowe and Shakespeare is to Elizabethan drama. It is the highest name. Ghalib in particular is a world-class genius. His poetry is dense and difficult. But to give you a picture both of Ghalib's own writing and the kind of mores of the court of the time, I would just read you one of his letters. This is very typical of Ghalib's prose. He's writing to a friend of his whose mistress has just died. And the guy is in mourning for this girlfriend. And Ghalib says, cut it out. Mirza Sahab, I don't like the way you're going on. In the days of my lusty youth, a man of perfect wisdom counselled me, abstinence I do not approve of, dissoluteness I do not forbid. Eat, drink, and be merry. But remember that the wise fly settles on sugar and never on honey. Well, I've always acted by this counsel. Give thanks to God for your freedom and do not grieve. When I think of paradise and consider how, if my sins are forgiven me, this passage should be read to every future potential suicide bomber. When I think of paradise and consider how, if my sins are forgiven me and I'm installed in a palace with a houri, to live forever in that worthy woman's company, I am filled with fear and dismay. How wearisome to always find her there, a greater burden than a man could bear. The same old palace, all of emerald made, the same old fruit tree to cast its shade, and God forbid her from all harm, the same old houri on my arm. Come to your senses, brother, and take another. Take a new woman with each returning spring, for last year's almanac's a useless thing. So you get a picture of the court of the time. This is no dull, puritanical, Wahhabi sort of center of hypocrisy. This is a lively court life full of interesting painting. This is by the last of the great Mughal painters, Ghulam Ali Khan. Zafar at the top, is writing his poetry. These are his notebooks in the British Library. Even if you can't read the Urdu, you get the impression of the guy's restless imagination filling the gutters and the margins of his notebooks. This is an example of Zafar's own calligraphy. And while all this is going on, Delhi is a major center of learning, of art, of literature, and of knowledge. The Delhi madrasas. Today madrasas are, again in the popular press, associated exclusively with terrorism and so on. Daily Mail calls them terror colleges. At this time, the Delhi madrasas are buzzing with the same sort of excitement and contradictions which were to grip Oxford a generation later when Darwin's ideas were unleashed in them. Here, for the first time, the new ideas of the West are coming into contact with the old Hindu and Islamic cosmologies. People are trying to reconcile the learnings of the different worlds. One of the nicest letters to give a feeling of the period is the biography of the poet Altaf Hussain Hali, who's another of the great Urdu poets of the period. Hali at this period is a newly married young man in a Mofussil provincial town of Panipat, about 100 miles north of Delhi. And one night he creeps out of his home and tiptoes away, sleeping rough, and heads off, like Dick Whittington, to London, to Delhi, not to make his fortune, but to come into contact with this exciting renaissance which is going on in the city. Everyone wanted me to look for a job, he wrote later, but my passion for learning prevailed. Delhi, he says, was at the center a center of huge intellectual excitement. 6 famous madrasas and 4 smaller ones. 9 newspapers in Urdu and Persian. 5 intellectual journals published out of Delhi College alone. More booksellers than the rest of India put together. But the biggest draw of all, he writes, were the poets and the intellectuals. Men such as Ghalib, Zork, Saba and Azoda. By some good fortune, he writes, there gathered at this time in the capital, Delhi, a band of men so talented that their meetings and assemblies recalled the great days of Akbar and Shah Jahan. Hali's family eventually drags him back. But before they did so, he gained admittance to the very spacious and beautiful madrasa of Hussain Bakhsh, there to begin his studies. I saw with my own eyes this last brilliant glow of learning in Delhi, he wrote with regret at the end of his life, the thought of which now makes my heart crack with regret. Here is William Sleeman, who was one of the British residents and governors of the period, writing about the madrasas. He was no friend of the Mughals. He was almost personally responsible for the annexation of the kingdom of Awadh. But here's what he writes when he came across the quality of learning in Delhi at this period in the madrasa system. Perhaps there are few communities in the world, he writes, among whom education is more generally diffused than among the Mohammedans of Delhi. Sorry, the Mohammedans of India. He who holds an office worth only 20 rupees a month commonly gives his sons an education equal to one of our prime ministers. They learn through the medium of Arabic and Persian what young men in our colleges learn through Greek and Latin, that is, grammar, rhetoric, and logic. After 7 years of study, the young Mohammedan binds his turban upon a head almost as well filled with things appertaining to those branches of knowledge as a young man raw from Oxford. And he will talk as fluently about Socrates and Aristotle, Plato and Hippocrates, Galen and Avicenna, alias Socrates, Aristoteles, Aflatun, Bokrat, Chalinus, Abu Anisina, and what is much to his advantage in India, the languages in which he has learnt these things are those which he requires throughout his working life. So this is not a world grinding down to extinction and degeneracy. This is a world which, despite its poverty and despite its loss of empire, has found itself in the middle of an extraordinary renaissance. Everything is buzzing, particularly, above all things, the world of literature. This is the great moment of Urdu poetry. Equivalent, as I say, to the reign of Elizabeth, what it was to English drama or the English sonnet.